The Center for Human Rights Research is located at the University of Manitoba's Fort Garry campus, which is on the ancestral and continued lands of the Anishinaabe, the Innu, the Anishinaabe, the Ochete-Sakowin, and also on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. All of us in these territories are governed by the promises and the relationships, much of them unfulfilled, of Treaty 1, the first of Canada's numbered treaties, and also of the Manitoba Act. We recognize that those of us in southern Manitoba have benefited from and continue to benefit from colonization, particularly of Treaty 1 lands, but also of the waters of Treaty 3 and the hydroelectric power of Treaty 5 territories. My name is Adele Perry. I am a settler, I am a feminist, I am a mom, I am a historian and a professor at the University of Manitoba, where I teach in the departments of history and in the Women's and Gender Studies program. And it's my real honor to be the director of the Center for Human Rights Research. Since 2012, the Center for Human Rights Research at the University of Manitoba has been supporting interdisciplinary and collaborative projects to research and advocate for human rights and Indigenous sovereignties and resurgence. This podcast is called Just Research, and it brings into focus work that researchers, activists, and advocates, and people that are all three, have been doing in their work for social justice. We welcome you to Just Research. On the fourth episode of this season, we talked with Brenda Gunn, a professor at Robson Hall, Faculty of Law at the University of Manitoba. Brenda Gunn's academic work and advocacy encompasses a wide variety of issues relating to Indigenous peoples in the law, exploring both Indigenous treaty rights in Canada and Manitoba and international law and Indigenous rights. In this conversation, we talked to Brenda about her teaching and her previous projects, including the creation of a handbook on the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, how she found herself working on these different projects, and what legal studies can contribute to issues of Indigenous people and human rights. Well, today we're really honored to have Professor Brenda Gunn from the Faculty of Law at the University of Manitoba join us on the Just Research podcast. And we just wondered if you maybe wanted to just begin by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Tanche wow, Brenda Gunn Nikashom in Machifnio, Winnipeg, Hi everyone. I am a Red River Métis woman who lives and works in Winnipeg. I am a professor in the Faculty of Law. I also have a 5-year-old that keeps me jumping and keeps me quite busy. And I'm really excited to be on the podcast today.
So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your research and what its implications are for life as it unfolds in Treaty 1 territory and other parts of Canada, and maybe even for teaching.
Thanks, Adele. I'm really excited to be able to talk more about my research, which over the past couple of decades has focused a lot on international human rights law and the intersections with Indigenous peoples' rights. And part of that work has been pushing for the general human rights standards that have existed to ensure that they apply to Indigenous peoples, while also working to understand how Indigenous peoples understand human rights and how Western understandings of human rights need to be modified to better reflect Indigenous peoples' realities and experiences of violations. And so part of my work has also been looking at how Indigenous rights, especially international human rights law, is applicable here in Canada. One of the reasons I ended up spending so much time in this area with that sort of intersection between domestic and international law and Indigenous law, as it turns out, is because there was a lot of people working domestically in the legal field around Aboriginal rights and sort of Section 35 of the Constitution Act that recognizes and affirms the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. And then there was a lot of people that were working internationally to develop the jurisprudence around Indigenous peoples' human rights. But I wasn't seeing a lot of that international work infiltrating here in Canada. as well as wanting to ensure that international work continues to be informed by developments and realities on the ground. So I found myself in that place of sort of sometimes translating up and translating down, or translating out and translating in. However, up and down always sounds hierarchical, but it's more about the spaces, right? So that has been a big part of work. And then, especially in the last, I don't know, 5, 10 years, that work always seems to get singularly focused down to the UN Declaration. And so while I've always considered my research to be broader on international human rights law, including the UN Declaration, often I either get pigeonholed into the UN Declaration, or that's just the part that people are most interested about, because I guess it's one of the newer international human rights instruments out there, and people are really interested in trying to wrap their heads around what that means.
Yeah, so to talk about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and how you kind of keep on ending either being placed back with it or gravitating back toward it. Is it just because it's new, or is there something in particular about that instrument that sheds that makes it something that you keep returning to or keep being asked to return to?
Yeah, so definitely the interest in the UN Declaration, I attribute strongly to the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which referred to the UN Declaration as a framework for reconciliation in Canada. And as part of the calls to action, then called on basically every segment of Canadian society to be educated about the UN Declaration and working towards its realization here. So that support for the UN Declaration really shifted things in Canada. And it went from me talking about international human rights law and the UN Declaration and no one caring and sort of brushing it off as not real and not important, to now, oh my goodness, everyone wants to learn. So, I probably do at least 2 presentations a month for the last 5 years on the UN Declaration, to various audiences. And so definitely people are turning to the calls to action and seeing that. And so a lot of my work on the education side, especially sort of public education, gets really focused on the UN Declaration. And then that ends up driving the research, right? If that's the thing that people are always wanting you to talk about, that's the thing that you end up spending so much time staying focused and a part of. And then also internationally, the UN Declaration is starting to get a lot of traction. So a lot of the big publishers, European publishers in particular, are really interested in having larger collections with references to the UN Declaration. So, being asked to either edit or contribute to some of these large publications that are sort of the big tombs or tomes, how do you say that word? I don't even know. On the UN Declaration, then also sort of drives that work. But I try in all the lens that I do to talk about, we don't just talk about the UN Declaration out of context. We always want to talk about where it fits within the broader international human rights law, past, present, future sort of approach.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Maybe, 100 years from now, and I say this like as a historian, thinking that how cool it'll be to kind of look back at at UNDRIP as such a revealing kind of window into so many different things. And there's a reason for that kind of interest and engagement that you're finding. So the Center for Human Rights Research has a couple of different research themes, and one of them is what's framed right now as Indigenous peoples and human rights. And I'm wondering if you can kind of speak a little bit to that framing. What's the way that those kind of analytic categories and human experiences fit together, and how maybe do they also, in some other respects, kind of brush up against one another in your research?
Yeah. Such an important question. Engaging Indigenous people's rights with a human rights framework has not been without challenges and without contention. There are people who have strongly opposed the use of a human rights framework on the basis that Indigenous people's rights are not human rights, but are Indigenous rights. And so are kind of a, to use the legal term sui generis, gosh, I can't believe that almost came out of my mouth. But are unique and are a category of their own. And so people want to kind of keep that distinction alive. Um, from my perspective, there is no place in international law for Indigenous people's rights. And so insisting on keeping that distinction alive internationally leaves us sort of floating without a home. What engaging in the human rights arena has done is that it's put us in places with specific mechanisms that we can then try to move and engage with. So, from my perspective, the human rights lens is really important because of the way in which it's grounding Indigenous people's human rights and Indigenous people's rights in human rights law, as reminding us of the need to bind and recognize the humanity of Indigenous peoples. And when we look at the impacts of colonization in Canada and around the world, so much of the justifications of colonization and taking Indigenous people's lands, asserting new sovereignties, are really based on the premise that Indigenous peoples weren't peoples, right? And this is where Chief Justice Marshall in the 1800s has that famous line, that creates the doctrine of discovery based on the idea that Indigenous peoples are fierce savages whose occupation is war, right? So the taking away the humanity of Indigenous peoples has been one of the tools that has been used to lead to our different treatment. And we can see that, I think, throughout history. I also think human rights lenses are really important because um, it reminds us today that a denial of these rights is an ongoing denial of humanity of Indigenous peoples. And so many people want to say they're not racist, that they support Indigenous peoples. And then when they talk about the UN Declaration, it's like, oh, I believe Indigenous people's rights, but not this aspect, right? And so it's like, so you don't actually fully believe I'm a person equal to all other people, right? That there is somehow still that racism in there where people are okay justifying Indigenous peoples living in periods and in times and places where our health outcomes are significantly different. Our, you know, socioeconomic situation is very different. And so I think connecting it to the human rights framework has reminded us that we're talking about peoples. The other reason why I think Indigenous peoples have stuck with the human rights framework is just the sheer amount of success we've had in getting the human rights infrastructure and the human rights institutions and international human rights law to understand who Indigenous peoples are and what we need to do to protect and ensure that Indigenous peoples continue on as distinct peoples. So, a couple of examples that I can really think of is that initially, when Indigenous peoples were engaging in international human rights law in the 80s, 90s, and I guess even early aughts, um, human rights were really viewed from a Western liberal viewpoint where it's about protecting individuals and our autonomy and liberty so that, trying to create a world where every person is free and able to make all of their own decisions and we can do anything we want. except to the point where, our freedom bumps up and implicates someone else's freedom. And so it was all of this sort of this is the liberal conception of human rights. And Indigenous peoples have successfully gotten the human rights world to understand that when we talk about human rights and Indigenous peoples, there's a collective element about it. It's not just about me as an individual Métis woman, but it's also about the right of me to belong to the Red River Métis and for the Red River Métis Nation to continue to exist as a distinct peoples in Canada. And so that's a huge, huge shift in those founding principles. And so human rights law has been very malleable and adaptive to Indigenous peoples. So I often use the analogy that when it has come to human rights law, we haven't been the square peg that is forced to shave itself off to fit into the round hole, but rather us as a square peg has led human rights law to sort of change its shape to accommodate and support us. And there's a few more examples I can provide, but I've probably gone on long enough for now.
Yeah, I always think about, and I think it's a point you make in some of your published work, and it's a point that's picked up in the final report on the National Inquiry on Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, which is the importance of international human rights mechanisms for, in particular, addressing Indigenous women's rights in the 1980s and those kind of early days of legal successes for Indigenous peoples in Canada. And I don't know if
Yeah,
there's a particular connection there that you can speak to around Indigenous women's rights and human rights.
yeah. I think the use of human rights in relation to Indigenous women has been also incredibly successful. The early cases around the loss of status actually have led to international human rights law recognizing that the right to culture includes the right to reside on reserve and have adequate housing, and right, like, have been able to so robustly interpret these rights. I also think in relation to Indigenous women, human rights has been really important because sometimes the violations of rights that we experience are at the hands of our own governments and state governments. And so when it is the state that is involved in the profound violation of fundamental human rights, like the right to life and security of the person, it is hard to think of what other mechanism you can use, right? A domestic court really fails to sort of address the profound ways that the state is involved in these standards, as well as, it has been a useful tool when, as I said, our own governments may be complicit or implicated in the violations as well. And so taking it outside of Canada has been really important to shed the light on Canada. Um, because one of the things that international human rights law really focuses on is the naming and shaming. And people think that this is what makes it soft law or, not real law because it's not enforceable. But actually, the power of naming and shaming can sometimes be the thing that moves the courts and governments and political will the most, right? At least when we have governments that care about their reputation, and many governments do actually care about our reputation internationally. So it can be the place to really get Canada to move when the record we'd like to hold up as being a good record on human rights starts getting tarnished. So I think it's been very helpful in that way.
Yeah, no, those are such crucial points. I'm thinking about in particular as, speaking to you as a researcher and a scholar who works from the perspective of legal research and kind of the methodologies that kind of go along with that. And I was wondering if you wanted to speak a little bit about what is the particular kind of power or kind of capacity of legal scholarship for addressing these questions.
So Really great question. I don't know how much I've really thought about this because, in some ways, I'm very much not a traditional legal scholar. Some might put me more in the law and society type of realm. But I think the difference, perhaps, between some of my work and colleagues who work in the area from a politics perspective, perhaps, is that ability to fully understand how law operates and the levers involved in legal processes. Um, and so through my work, you know, we can talk about how the UN Declaration applies in Canada and how governments should be doing this, and we can focus on political will. But my work has focused more on just straight up rules of reception, right? And looking at how international law is supposed to apply in Canada and thinking about, where does the UN Declaration fit into that? And then you can talk about policy based reasons as well that support that. But it sort of, for me, has changed the focus from, shooting at the government to, you must be doing these sorts of things. It's also, I think, by using it in law grounds it there's a permanency to law, right? Well, it is supposed to be able to adjust and move on and accommodate changing circumstances. It's also an incredibly slow beast to change for better or worse, right? And so by engaging in international human rights law and Canadian law, I think it brings a bit more permanency to it once the judges start relying on it and it becomes part of the case law that's supposed to inform things moving forward, right? So I think there is a power to law that, for better or worse, I think that we try to harness to give grounding to Indigenous people's rights and Indigenous people's human rights.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it kind of provides a perspective on the particular work that kind of legal research and scholarship does on these questions. We wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about any future research plans you have, things that you're thinking about seeing on the horizon. Is there anything that you have sort of thought about pursuing, or things that have fallen to the side that you'd like to return to? What's on the agenda?
I'm laughing because I'm like, I could talk about all the chapters I've committed to write, and let's, fingers crossed, hope I actually finish some of those. Um, because my little brain is going to jump to 30 other projects before I finish any of them. But one of the things actually that I'm really excited about and thinking about, and it's not any of the chapters that I've committed to write, but is thinking about how the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples should be informing administrative law in Canada. Now, that probably does not sound interesting or to anyone, or people are going, what the heck does that mean? But administrative law is the area of law where, when the government makes a decision and you don't like the decision, either because the process they took or the actual decision they made, if you don't like the decision, administrative law is where you challenge those decisions. So these decisions can include any environmental regulation decisions, any licenses for mining, forestry, etc. So anytime the government makes a decision, it is potentially reviewable, and it's reviewable as a judicial review is the type of law. And it's administrative law that, where all those rules are found. And people are probably aware of things like procedural fairness, right? So the idea that when the government makes a decision, it should follow certain processes that ensure fairness in the decision, right? So this is why sometimes the government, has to give public notification of decisions and give people an opportunity to have input. This is why government in many circumstances has to give written decisions so that we can actually read them and understand the decision. So if you want to challenge it, so all of these areas. And so what I'm really interested to think about is not just thinking of how to, how do we need to work to implement the substantive rights in the UN Declaration, but how does that really influence how we make decisions in Canada and elsewhere, right? So yeah, so trying to think about all of that. And so that could get us into, we focus a lot about the courts, and courts have been working on, creating different rules to ensure that Indigenous peoples get justice and, that it can accommodate. But administrative law also deals with administrative tribunals. And I had no idea what these were before law school. But people might be familiar with like the residential tenancy branch, right? That if you have a problem with your landlord, there's a board or somewhere you can go. Um, there's a board you can go to if you're denied daycare subsidy and you think you should attend. There's also like a workers' compensation board, right? And then there's all the environmental boards. We have a bunch in Manitoba, you know, public utilities board. Every time we want to raise the rates of utilities, they're, overseen. So all of these bodies make so many decisions on a day-to-day basis that impact, and it'd be administrative law where, we get in. And so, you know, the Canadian Radio Telecommunications Commission, the CRTC, I think that's what CRTC stands for. There's been a commissioner there who's made a few decisions, dissenting, so she's not agreeing with the result, dissenting decisions, where she started to engage with the UN Declaration and talk about the procedures that were followed in making the decisions and how they may not be upholding the procedural elements of the UN Declaration. So that's an area that I'm really interested in exploring and looking at, and hope to do a bit of work in writing on in the future.
What's funny, administrative law sounds like so prosaic, but those are like incredibly important mechanisms like of power and
Yeah.
also for their pursuit of justice.
Uh, and it includes all the human rights tribunals, right? So the Manitoba Human Rights Commission, the Canadian Human Rights Commission, and the Canadian Human Rights Tribunals. I'm trying not to just say acronyms, and then I realize I don't know what the actual words are. But yeah, like, so, sometimes when thinking about the need for laws to change to better ensure we're upholding international human rights law, you think of big changes, but sometimes it's like all these smaller places that can have, I think, really significant impacts on some of those more day-to-day realities.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned very briefly law school, and that brings to mind a question that we have, which is, do you have any kind of advice or thoughts you would pass on to emerging scholars, graduate students, folks that are beginning to work in the areas of research that you have been engaged with? Any
Does it
suggestions
have to
for
be
them
good
to
advice?
begin that?
I think I only have bad advice. One of the things that served me well, but is probably the thing that's going to do me in, is not always having a very set agenda and where I want to go and what I want to do. And so bouncing around, like my work on the UN Declaration or focus, kind of happened by accident ish. I was talking to one of my mentors. I'd just been appointed to the Faculty of Law, and I was like, okay, I need a research agenda. Suggage, what do I do? And, and he was, I guess, not nearing retirement age. I guess he was probably nearing retirement age, but he hadn't fully been turning his mind to retirement. But realizing, that there was time for some newer, younger scholars to start picking up some of this international work. And so he sort of was pushing me along to the UN Declaration. And then, we ended up talking about the need for the handbook. And so then I created the handbook in 2010 or something like that. I think it's or 2012. I can't remember how old it is, but and then you sort of just bumbling along and opportunities come up. And so a lot of my work has developed that way, and opportunities from sort of being open and not being super set. While at the same time, I could always define the parameters of my work, right? And what are the areas of interest that I had. But um, allowing myself to go along to different things. And I can't even, oh, and I guess like one of the areas that I guess I dabbled in, I don't know if you dabble in it, but after the death of Brian Sinclair at the Health Sciences Center, there was a group of people who were really frustrated with the inquest that wasn't wanting to look at systemic issues. And I got brought into some of that work for a while, and I didn't end up sticking with it because for a variety of reasons, but I was able for a moment in time to contribute to some of that work, talking about the international human rights aspects of the right to health and what that looks like. And then I still get random calls from media because they'll find something that I wrote around that time, like, oh, expert Indigenous people's health, da da da. And I'm like, well, no, I haven't followed in that area, but it was a really neat opportunity. And I got to work was on a project team for a while around with doctors and nurses and all sorts of health people that I had never, but we also had lawyers on the team and legal professionals and legal scholars. And so it was a really neat opportunity that way to be involved. And so I have a few sort of other projects that I, have participated on, especially early on, I think in my career, these sort of random little things. But then, like, international trade law is another area that keeps popping up in my work. I did my master's thesis on the impacts of international trade law on Indigenous peoples, and then thought that was going to be a bigger area of my work. And that was sort of then went nowhere because there were some changes in how NAFTA was being interpreted, and some of the concerns that were initially being raised weren't sort of playing out. But then when the new NAFTA was being negotiated, and now the current federal government is really interested, in gender chapters and Indigenous peoples chapters in trade agreements. And so there's a lot of work under the Trudeau government around Indigenous peoples and international trade. So, a decade later or so, 2 decades after my thesis, I end up writing another chapter on Indigenous peoples and international trade law and continuing to follow that work. So there's some sort of really neat opportunities that have kept up, have sort of kept me busy in fun ways. I think because I've always been open to that and haven't had a very set focus. But it'll also be my demise. There was a post on social media, and it was so funny. It spoke to me. What did it say? I need to stop saying yes to things because the deadline is far away. And so I very easily get excited about new projects, and I am not great on finishing projects. So the other advice that I'm learning now, and I guess I'm mid-career, am I starting to get late career? I don't know. How long is this career going to be? I guess maybe is the question. Is starting to be realistic in my strengths and making sure I'm working with people who complement my strengths and address my weaknesses. So this year has been a year of reflection, and I've really come to realize I'm not a finisher. Like, I will start any project you want me to, and I will bring so much enthusiasm and so much great work. but I cannot get things over the finish line because I will get bored or I'll move on or something will happen. And so finding more and more, one of the things is to partner with people who get things done, right? Who will force me to stay on this task and this project until it's finished, right? And so being gentle with myself for all the strings that are left dangling and being like, okay, if I'm going to work on a project, especially big projects, I need to have someone who will help me get her done.
And I think what you've just spoke to is one of the kind of the really prosaic but really powerful kind of arguments for working collaboratively as researchers. And that's something that folks who kind of are trained up in lab-based and other kind of project-based research, learn very early on. But those of us, and that's true for legal scholars and it's true for historians like myself who come from disciplines where we often work on our own, but working collaboratively is a real way to kind of find ways to kind of complement what you bring to the table. So super important. And I think also your point about remaining open to the different possibilities and to a changing world that we live in is a really important reminder. And your work with the Brian Sinclair Working Group, which people can Google and find out more about. Your work on UNDRIP are both kind of excellent examples. And I did not know about your work on international trade law. And those certainly with what we can see going on in the world right now, we can see that being something that folks will be returning to. And one of the things we know is that we need to have research going on all the time that can shed light on important questions. And that means pursuing topics that don't always look particularly relevant or sexy in the short term, but often in the long term, it becomes really clear how crucial it is to have that kind of depth of knowledge on those kinds of questions. So I want to thank you for taking the time. I am going to go off and try and learn something now about the international trade law, which will be a new area for me. But speaking to these connections between international human rights and Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women, the need for kind of flexibility and responsiveness in research, and I think making a really powerful argument for collaboration. So we really appreciate you talking about those things with us.
Well, thanks again so much for having me on and letting me share a bit about my work and the things that I think about.
Indigenous peoples' rights have historically been marginalized within Western and colonial socio-legal systems, both within Canada and internationally. Professor Brenda Gunn shows us some of the ways that this can be resisted by bringing human rights mechanisms and lenses at the international and local level into conversations with Indigenous rights, and showing us that Indigenous rights can be enlivened and imagined as human rights. We'd like to thank Professor Brenda Gunn for taking the time to talk to us in this episode of Just Research. This podcast was produced by the Center for Human Rights Research Knowledge Mobilization Coordinator, Angela Ciceron. And similar to other initiatives of the Center for Human Rights Research, it benefited tremendously from the work and acumen of Dr. Pauline Tennant. We'd also like to thank Michael Elves and the UMFM team for their support and guidance for this podcast.